Hi, I'm Paul from the Studio Rats. In today's video, we're going to be looking at the differences between overdrive pedals and distortion pedals. Now, I'm going to be using three different pedals for this demonstration. We've got an Ibanez Tube Screamer. This is a TS9. I think it's quite an old one, but Ibanez Tube Screamers more or less sound the same. We're going to be using a RYRA Klone or Klone style pedal. And we're also going to be using the Boss and JHS Angry Driver. Now, technically, the Angry Driver is an overdrive distortion, but the difference between overdrive and distortion, overdrive is, you can class it as soft clipping and distortion is hard clipping. So what does that mean? Well, originally, something like the Tube Screamer was invented to make an amplifier sound like it was turned up. When you drive power tubes on an amplifier, they start to distort in a really nice, pleasing way, and that's what you try and emulate with something like the Tube Screamer. Now I've got my amplifier here set up really clean, so if I just play some chords with the pedals off. So we'll start with the lightest overdrive pedal. Now, you could actually swap these two pedals around. The reason that I've got them like this is because you can actually get more drive out of a Klone style pedal. Well, particularly this sort of style, this RYRA Klone. But first of all, we'll start with the Tube Screamer. Now, as I said, the clean sound sounds like this. And that's the sound of the Tube Screamer. Now, if you listen carefully, you'll hear that the clean guitar sound is actually coming underneath the overdriven tone. If I sort of play something percussive, so you can hear that tone underneath. Now, the thing about the Tube Screamer, and for me, this is why I'm not a massive fan of Tube Screamers, is you get this sort of tone where the low frequencies have been filtered off, and that is useful for certain things, as I've demonstrated in other videos, and I will demonstrate later on. But that's the sound of the Tube Screamer. It's not that inspiring, especially with the Les Paul. Use it with a Strat does actually work a little bit better. But anyway, as I said, this is going through a clean amp at the moment. So if I turn the drive up on the Tube Screamer, let's go all the way. You can still hear that clean sound coming through as well. So let's mute that for the moment. A little bit later on, I'm going to be demonstrating all of these pedals just using a slightly overdriven amp as well, and you can hear how different these pedals react to an overdriven amp. Let's switch over to the Klone. Now again, here's a clean sound. Let's bring it in. So the great thing about the Klone is that you can use this as a boost pedal, and you can use it as an overdrive pedal. And if you turn up the drive, it sort of verges on the sort of light distortion sort of side. But anyway, this is the sound of the Klone as like a boost pedal. So it's way more usable to me than a Tube Screamer. The thing that's great about the Klone style pedals is that now the amp is starting to sound like you're turning it up a little bit. Now hear what happens when I play a chord and then turn the gain up on the Klone. So we've got to halfway and almost nothing has happened. Now, all of a sudden, as you get to about sort of 1, 2 o'clock on the control, now it starts to drive. So there's the sound of a Klone sort of style pedal. Now to me, the useful sounds on a Klone are using it as a boost and just turning the gain up full, because you can get some really nice sort of saturated lead tones from it. Now this is where things start to become a little bit interesting, because most people when they're practicing can't really turn their amps up to a decent level where the power tubes are working in a really nice way. Because when some people buy overdrive pedals, the sound they might actually be searching for is a distortion pedal. Now the distortion pedal, what it's going to do is completely change the sound of your amp. So your amp matters less when you're using a distortion style pedal than when you're using an overdrive pedal, because that's where the term transparent comes from, because we're still keeping the sound of our amplifier, but we're just driving it slightly. Now with distortion pedals, we can completely change the sound. So let's switch on the Angry Driver. Now we're getting into that really sort of saturated tone where it sounds like the preamp tubes are working and it sounds like the power tubes are working, even though we're using a fairly quiet amp. And that's where you can get that really sort of saturated / appetite for destruction type sound. There's loads of different styles of distortion pedals with different sort of EQ circuits, but if you listen to the low end of the Angry Driver, it's got a bit of a sort of flubby bottom end. It's not very tight. Now to me, this is where a Tube Screamer comes in handy, because as I said earlier, it sort of takes the bottom end off and it can tighten up the guitar tone. So now if I switch in the Tube Screamer, it really tightens up the bottom end. So that's the sound of all of these pedals going into a pristine clean amp. Now if I turn up the gain on my amp so we get like an amp on the verge of breakup, personally this is how I like to set up an amp. So we're driving the power tubes just a little bit more, and the preamp gain is just pushing into those power tubes, which makes it sound, to my ears, great. So now if I bring in the Tube Screamer, right, now we can get some of that sort of AC/DC tone, because as I said, the clean signal or the sound of the amp, which is slightly driven, is now coming through, but we're also getting the tone of the Tube Screamer. The great thing about using a Tube Screamer like this is because it's really tightening up the bottom end. So let's turn it off. You see we've got lots of bottom end in there. If I bring it in, it really shaves off that bottom end, and that's great for live if you've got a bass player and a drummer and you really just want to let the guitar signal poke through the mix, and you want to get away from those sort of low frequencies which the bass and the drums are taking up. So next over to the Klone. Where the Klone before sounded really great going into a really clean amp, now it's starting to sound a little bit mid-heavy and a little bit honky. So if I turn up the treble a little bit, doesn't sound that great going into a slightly driven amp. But if I turn the gain up, it becomes more useful, but it's still got that sort of mid honk. So if I bring the gain all the way back, now this is where the Klone is useful, because we can use it, as I said earlier, as a boost pedal, so we can push the front of the amp even more. So if you're the sort of player that's always got a slightly driven amp, the Klone might not be the right sort of pedal for you. If you're the sort of player that's got like a real sort of high headroom amp, something like a 2-Rock or some of the bigger Fenders, the Klone style pedal can work really, really well. Okay, let's go over to the distortion pedal, which is the Angry Driver. it sounds really good, but again, it's still got that sort of flubby bottom end. So again, we can use the Tube Screamer to tighten up the bottom end. And that for me is the reason why I have quite a few different drive pedals on my board, because I don't really know the situation that I'm going to be in. Anyway, I really hope you guys got something out of this. If you did get something out of it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Click on the bell button and you'll be notified of any future video that comes out from the Studio Rats. I'm Paul and I'll see you next time. Cheers.